All right. So hello, everyone. This is a redo of the original meeting where we had 10 or 12 participants last Monday night. It's Thursday, the 1st of October. But I wanted to do this hopefully correctly this time by having the correct screen showing, because I showed my notes last time. Hopefully you'll enjoy this one better. This is session 1 of Pope Francis Laudato Si. We're doing 4 sessions, one every Monday night at 7 o'clock. And I hope you'll join us for the next one, next Monday at 7, so you can be part of the discussion afterwards. Let's start off with a prayer. Loving God, creator of heaven and earth and all that is in them, help us to be conscious of our common home, that it belongs not only to us, but to all future generations, and that it is our responsibility to preserve it. Make us courageous and embrace the changes that are needed in search of the common good. So thank you for taking an interest and being here. September, we were celebrating the release of Laudato Si 5 years ago. The whole month was a celebration. And it continues through this Saturday, which is the Feast of St. Francis. But this letter from the Pope is very special to me. It's the strongest position any leader in a position of authority has ever taken on the issue of earth care. And we all know about the warnings of climate change. And I decided to leave out chapter 1, which is where the Pope does that, until session 4, in hopes that by approaching the spirituality aspect first, it will help you to consider the importance of this message a little more seriously. So tonight I want to touch on spirituality and the possibility of a change of heart. The Pope speaks about the earth and climate as creation. And I like this approach because it's not divisive. Instead of speaking about climate change or polar bears, we're talking about creation, the gift that God gave to all of us. My greatest fear is that we could let this crucial message to mankind slip away among the noise and partisanship. So I enthusiastically encourage you to order a copy on Amazon. It's only 10 bucks. The joy that I experienced reading this 200-page letter to all people of the earth is really hard to describe. I think you'll find it in its entirety online also for free. But my hope is that these little samplings that I'm going to be giving tonight will give you a boost to consider doing that. So there are 7 chapters in Laudato Si. Tonight we're going to, 6 chapters and an introduction. Tonight we're going to touch on the Gospel of Creation, chapter 2, and followed by the introduction. So I remember the excitement in the environmental community when this came out. Finally, a serious voice prioritizing the care of our common home. But that was in 2015, the same year as the Paris Accord. At that time, it looked like our world was working in tandem on the terrible man-made problem of climate change. But then came the election of 2016. But my hope is that we'll try and reconsider that it's time to pick up where we left off. So at the time, various publications pointed out that until now, the environmental dialogue has been framed mainly with political, scientific, and economic language. With this encyclical, the language of faith entered the discussion, clearly, decisively, and systematically. So there are 7 sections in chapter 7 that we're going to touch on. I believe the Pope's goal in this chapter is to stir in us a reason for our being. Why do we exist? It may also be to help non-believers to understand where we're coming from. So in this first section, the Pope explains the Catholic Church is open to dialogue with philosophical thought to produce various synthesis between faith and reason. The development of the Church's social teachings represents just such a synthesis with regard to social issues. And that's been over the last few centuries. The development, this teaching is called to be enriched by taking up new challenges, and by this he means climate change. The spiritual perspective is now part of the discussion on the environment. This does not mean that Pope Francis is imposing his belief on those concerned about the environment. He writes, "I'm well aware that not all are believers. Why should this document, addressed to all people of goodwill, include a chapter dealing with the convictions of believers?" He says that in the areas of politics and philosophy, there are those who firmly reject the idea of a creator or consider it irrelevant, and consequently dismiss as irrational the rich contribution which religions can make towards an integral ecology and the full development of humanity. Others view religion simply as a subculture to be tolerated. I think he's hoping that those people will consider the contribution that faith can offer. Nonetheless, science and religion, this is the Pope speaking, with their distinctive approaches to understanding reality, can enter into an intense dialogue, fruitful for both. The encyclical invites others to listen to the religious point of view, particularly its understanding of creation as a holy and precious gift from God, to be reverenced by all men and women. I interpret his invitation to be asking non-believers to consider a renewed look at the Judeo-Christian teachings as they apply to our common home. So the second section, Pope offers these beautiful words. He says, God's plan includes creating humanity. After the creation of man and woman, God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. The Bible teaches that every man and woman is created out of love and made in God's image and likeness. That's from Genesis. This shows us the immense dignity of each person, who is not just something, but someone. He's capable of self-knowledge, of self-possession, of freely giving himself and entering into communion with other persons. This is what the Pope's asking us to do. He offers his deepest reasons for this commitment when he says, how wonderful is the certainty that each human life is not adrift in the midst of hopeless chaos, in a world ruled by pure chance or endlessly recurring cycles. Each of us is willed, each of us is loved, and each of us is necessary to keep creation on course. The creation accounts in the book of Genesis suggest that human life is grounded in three fundamental and closely intertwined relationships: with God, with our neighbor, and with the earth itself. According to the Bible, these three vital relationships have been broken, both outwardly and within us. The rupture is sin. The harmony between Creator, humanity, and creation as a whole was disrupted by our presuming to take the place of God and refusing to acknowledge our creaturely limitations. This in turn distorted our mandate to have dominion over the earth, to till it and keep it. As a result, the originally harmonious relationship between human beings and nature became conflictual. That's not good. The spirituality which forgets God as an all-powerful and creator is not acceptable. The Pope says this is how we end up worshiping earthly powers or ourselves, usurping the place of God, even to the point of claiming an unlimited right to trample his creation underfoot. The best way to restore men and women to their rightful place, putting an end to their claim to absolute dominion over the earth, is to speak once more of the figure of a father who creates, and who alone owns the world. Otherwise, human beings will always try to impose their own laws and interests on reality. I recommend reading this section. He speaks of the incorrect and destructive interpretation of the concept of dominion referenced in Genesis, which arose in the Industrial Revolution. He says it should correctly mean caring, protecting, overseeing, and preserving. He says we must respect the laws of nature, and he references biblical accounts of Cain and Abel, Noah, Psalms, the prophets, urging us to contemplate the all-powerful God who created the universe. The Pope cites St. Francis' relationship with nature and returning to the state of original innocence with nature. In the next chapter, let's see. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, the word creation has a broader meaning than just nature. Nature is a system to be studied, understood, and controlled. The act of creation was not out of chaos, not as an arbitrary act of omnipotence or self-assurance. Creation is of the order of love. God's love is the fundamental moving force of all created things. In Wisdom 11:24, it says, "For you love all things that exist and detest none of the things that you have made, for you would not have made anything if you had hated it." Every creature is thus the object of the Father's tenderness, who gives it its place in the world. Even the fleeting life of the least of beings is the object of his love. And in its few seconds of existence, God enfolds it with his affection. St. Basil the Great described the Creator as goodness without measure. The Pope explains that because we affect nature, we no longer see it as divine. If we acknowledge the value and the fragility of nature, and at the same time our God-given abilities, we can finally leave behind the modern myth of unlimited material progress. A fragile world entrusted by God to human care challenges us to devise intelligent ways of directing, developing, and limiting our power. In this universe shaped by open and intercommunicating systems, we can discern countless forms of relationship and participation. Faith allows us to interpret the meaning and the mysterious beauty of what is unfolding. We are free to apply our intelligence towards things evolving positively or towards adding new ills, causing new causes of suffering and real setbacks. This is what makes for the excitement and drama of human history, in which freedom, growth, salvation, and love can blossom, or leads towards decadence and mutual destruction. In a passage on prayer, the Pope says, God can bring good out of evil. Something new can always emerge. Nature is nothing other than a certain kind of art, namely God's art. But we need to do our part. Finally, in the mystery of the universe, he says the ultimate destiny of the universe is the fullness of God, which has already been attained by the risen Christ, the measure of the maturity of all things. So for the last 2,000 years, we've been in a state of maturity since Christ arrived. All creatures are moving forward with us and through us toward a common point of arrival, which is God, in that transcendent fullness where the risen Christ embraces and illumines all things. Human beings endowed with intelligence and love are drawn by the fullness of Christ and are called to lead all creatures back to the Creator. In this section, the Pope says all creatures have their own purpose. The entire material universe speaks of God's love, his boundless affection for us. Soil, water, mountains, everything is, as it were, a caress of God. Linked to a particular places which take on intensely personal meaning, we all remember places, and revisiting those memories does us much good. In my case, I was born in Hayes, and this is the house where I was raised. And these are the hills north of Hayes where I explored the Saline River. And behind our house was a sandlot baseball diamond where boys and girls alike played baseball all the time. And it was wonderful. And my grandmother's house in Kinsley had beautiful gardens. And she taught me the love of the outdoors. And you know, the Pope says in this chapter, anyone who's grown up in the hills or used to sit by the spring to drink or played outdoors in the neighborhood square, going back to these places is a chance to recover something of their true selves. I think he's talking about our innocent selves, where we appreciated nature and we appreciated life. God has written a precious book whose letters are the multitude of created things present in the universe. So growing up, I developed a connection to creation, and I think most people do. And I carry that today. So how do we connect to that care, for our care of our common home? So in the bishops of Japan note, there's a divine manifestation in the blaze of the sun and the fall of night. Paying attention to this manifestation, we learn to see ourselves in relation to all other creatures. I express myself in expressing the world. In my effort to decipher the sacredness of the world, I explore my own. So then we move into the fifth portion, and this is a beautiful section, the universal communion. As part of the universe called into being by one Father, all of us are linked by unseen bonds and together form a kind of universal family, a sublime communion which fills us with sacred, affectionate, and humble respect. Everything is connected. God has joined us closely to the world around us. Concern for the environment thus needs to be joined to a sincere love of our fellow human beings and an unwavering commitment to resolving the problems of society. I believe the point of section 5 is that our communion with nature cannot be real if our hearts lack tenderness, compassion, and concern for our fellow human beings and creatures. That's the Pope speaking. The Pope appeals to our sense of fraternity that excludes nothing and no one. He says peace, justice, and the preservation of creation are three absolutely interconnected themes. Human beings have a unique worth and a tremendous responsibility. It follows that our indifference or cruelty towards fellow creatures of this world sooner or later affects the treatment we met out to other human beings. We have only one heart, and the same wretchedness which leads us to mistreat an animal will not be long in showing itself in our relationships to other people. He says we should be particularly indignant at the enormous inequalities in our midst, where some consider themselves more worthy than others. We'll have a whole section on this topic later in the fall, I believe with Susan Tabor. Section 6 starts getting into the crux of the problem. The New Zealand bishops ask what the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," means when 20% of the world's population consumes resources at a rate that robs the poor nations and future generations of what they need to survive. The earth is a shared inheritance. If we make something our own, it is only to administer it for the good of all. If we do not, we burden our conscience with the weight of having denied the existence of others. I offered some examples here of what Americans consume more than other countries for possible discussion. We'll be going into this more in future sessions, and possibly in a group that we form following the 4 sessions. So where is America headed? Is this the American dream? Squalor for the many, mega mansions for the few, while the world cooks? The Christian tradition has never recognized the right of private property as absolute or inviolable, and has stressed the social purpose of all forms of private property. In the final section, 7 of chapter 2, Jesus took up the biblical faith in God the Creator, emphasizing the fundamental truth, God is Father. Jesus would invite the disciples to recognize the paternal relationship God has with all his creatures. With moving tenderness, he would remind them that each one of them is important in God's eyes. The Lord was able to invite others to be attentive to the beauty that there is in the world because he himself was in constant touch with nature, leading to an attention full of fondness and wonder. As he made his way throughout the land, he often stopped to contemplate the beauty sown by his Father and invited his disciples to perceive a divine message in things. Jesus worked with his hands, and it's striking that most of his life was dedicated to this task in a simple life which awakened no admiration at all. Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary? Mark 6:3. In this way, he sanctified human labor and endowed it with a special significance for our development. As St. John Paul II taught, by enduring the toil of work in union with Christ crucified for us, man in a way collaborates with the Son of God for the redemption of humanity. And the Pope will speak more about the importance and dignity of work. So one person of the Trinity entered into the created cosmos, throwing in his lot with it, even to the cross. From the beginning of the world, but particularly through the incarnation, the mystery of Christ is at work in a hidden manner in the natural world as a whole, without thereby impinging on its autonomy. The question we should ponder is, how can we help bring the spiritual aspect of creation into the conversation with our friends and neighbors? That concludes chapter 2, the Gospel of Creation. I pray that we can visit it often as we try to embrace Pope Francis' encyclical on the care of our common home. Now, to wrap up this session, the Pope's introduction on Laudato Si. So there's these 5 parts. In the first, the Pope begins with, "Praise be to you, my Lord." In the words of this beautiful canticle, St. Francis of Assisi reminds us that our common home is like a sister with whom we share our life and a beautiful mother who opens her arms to embrace us. Praise be to you, my Lord, through our sister Mother Earth, who sustains and governs us, and who produces various fruit with colored flowers and herbs. Then, in the second paragraph, he issues a warning. We have come to see ourselves as her lords and masters, entitled to plunder her at will. The violence present in our hearts, wounded by sin, is also reflected in the symptoms of sickness evident in the soil, in the water, in the air, and in all forms of life. This is why the earth herself, burdened and laid waste, is among the most abandoned and maltreated of our poor. She groans in travail. A big part of my motivation for offering this series is my concern that we've fallen away from our respect for papal teachings, and that we can cherry pick those that we agree with. When it was released, many writers explained an encyclical is a type of teaching that enjoys the highest level of authority in the Church, second only to the Gospels and church councils like Vatican II. So what is an encyclical? Well, a papal encyclical is one of the highest forms of communication by the Pope, and usually deals with some aspect of Catholic teaching, clarifying, amplifying, condemning, or promoting one of several issues. A papal encyclical historically is addressed to the bishops and priests of a country or region, or to all clergy, or encyclicals can be addressed to all Catholic faithful. But this time the Pope said this encyclical is meant for everyone and not just Catholics. This encyclical is aimed at everyone, he says. Let us pray that everyone can receive its message and grow in responsibility towards the common home that God has given us. Against those who argue that papal encyclical on the environment has no real authority, Pope Francis explicitly states, Laudato Si is now added to the body of the Church's social teachings. I did some research on papal supremacy, and the Catholic doctrine on papal supremacy is based on the assertion by the bishops of Rome that it was instituted by Christ, and that papal succession is traced back to Peter the Apostle in the 1st century. Irenaeus of Lyon in AD 189 wrote that Peter and Paul had founded the Church of Rome and had appointed Pope Linus to the office of the episcopate, the beginning of the succession of the Roman See. The arrival ministries, and especially the martyrdoms of Peter and Paul, were the seminal events that really constituted the Church of Rome. It was from their time, and not before, that an orderly and meetly ordained succession of bishops originated. As I said, my motivation in doing these is that many Catholics dismiss this. And for me, recognizing the Pope's authority was partially the conversion of the apostles at Pentecost. They went from denial and fear for their lives as Jesus was led away to his death on the cross to a new existence once they were filled with the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. And as a result, they embarked on an inspired and determined evangelical mission, even unto being martyred. The growth of Christianity from the time of the apostles is an indication to me of God's method of working through his chosen people, and especially our priests and popes. The early church appointing a papal supremacy in one man seems inspired by the Holy Spirit, and it makes sense. There have been bad popes, sure, but after all, man is sinful by nature. The difference is those popes who follow the Holy Spirit. I think Pope Francis does, and I'm disappointed that many Catholics fail to accept his authority, basically ignoring him and calling him a socialist pope. So in this segment of the introduction, Pope Francis recalls the encyclicals of 4 popes. More than 50 years ago, with the world teetering on the brink of nuclear crisis, Pope St. Paul XXIII wrote an encyclical which not only rejected war, but offered a proposal for peace. He addressed his message, Pacem in Terris, to the entire Catholic world, and indeed to all men and women of goodwill. Now, faced as we are with global environmental deterioration, I wish to address every person living on this planet. In 1971, 8 years after Pacem in Terris, Blessed Pope Paul VI referred to the ecological concern as a tragic consequence of unchecked human activity. Due to an ill-considered exploitation of nature, humanity runs the risk of destroying it and becoming in turn a victim of this degradation. He spoke in similar terms to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations about the potential for an ecological catastrophe under the effective explosion of industrial civilization, and stressed the urgent need for a radical change in the conduct of humanity. Insomuch as the most extraordinary scientific advances, the most amazing technical abilities, the most astonishing economic growth, unless they're accompanied by authentic social and moral progress, will definitely turn against man. St. Paul John II became increasingly concerned about this issue. In his first encyclical, he warned that human beings frequently seem to see no other meaning in their natural environment than what serves their immediate use and consumption. At the same time, he noted that little effort had been made to safeguard the moral conditions for an authentic human ecology. The destruction of the human environment is extremely serious, not only because God has entrusted the world to us men and women, but because human life is itself a gift which must be defended from various forms of debasement, including our common home. My predecessor, Benedict XXVI, proposed a book of nature is one and indivisible. The book of nature is one and indivisible, and concludes that the environment, life, sexuality, the family, social relations, and so forth. It follows that the deterioration of nature is closely connected to the culture which shapes human existence. The natural environment has been gravely damaged by our irresponsible behavior. The social environment has also suffered damage. Both are ultimately due to the same evil, the notion that there are no indisputable truths to guide our lives, and hence human freedom is limitless. We've forgotten that man is not only a freedom which he creates for himself. Man does not create himself. He is spirit and will, but also nature. With paternal concern, Benedict urged us to realize that creation is harmed when we ourselves have the final word, where everything is simply our property and we use it for ourselves alone. The misuse of creation begins when we no longer recognize any higher instance than ourselves, when we see nothing else but ourselves. These statements of the Pope's echo the reflections of numerous scientists, philosophers, theologians, and civic groups. This is the Pope speaking, all of which have enriched the Church's thinking on these questions. And then I throw this in. Outside the Catholic Church, other churches and Christian communities and other religions have expressed deep concern and offered valuable reflections on issues from which all of us find disturbing. Those are the words of the Pope, but I show these different churches. And finally, the Pope says of St. Francis, I believe that St. Francis is the example par excellence of care for the vulnerable and of the integral ecology lived out joyfully and authentically. He's the patron saint of all who study and work in the area of ecology, and he is also much loved by non-Christians. Francis helped us to see that an integral ecology calls for openness to categories which transcend the language of mathematics and biology, and takes us into the heart of what it is to be a human. Just as happens when we fall in love with someone. Whenever he would gaze at the sun, the moon, or the smallest of animals, he burst into song, drawing all creatures into his praise. His response to the world around him was so much more than intellectual appreciation or economic calculus, for to him, each and every creature was a sister, united to him by bonds of affection. That's why he felt called to care for all that exists. If we approach nature and the environment without this openness to awe and wonder, if we no longer speak the language of fraternity and beauty in our relationship with the world, our attitude will be that of masters, consumers, ruthless exploiters, unable to set limits on their immediate needs. If we feel intimately united with all that exists, then sobriety and care will well up spontaneously. The poverty and austerity of St. Francis were no mere veneer of aestheticism, but something much more radical, a refusal to turn reality into an object, simply to be used and controlled. St. Francis invites us to see nature as a magnificent book in which God speaks to us and grants us a glimpse of his infinite beauty and goodness. Through the greatness and the beauty of creatures, one comes to know by analogy their maker. Wisdom 13:5. Rather than a problem to be solved, the world is a joyful mystery to be contemplated with gladness and praise. So thank you very much. Next time, in our effort to establish the importance of the encyclical and care for our common home, we will cover chapter 3 and chapter 4. God bless you until then. I hope you'll join us next Monday at 7. And for those that wish to stick around, we can discuss tonight's chapter 2 now with these questions. So I'm not going to continue any longer, but if you can glance over these, I hope that you'll join us next Monday night for our session and maybe join in the discussion as we work on establishing the importance for ourselves of Laudato Si. Thank you very much, and God bless.